Closing conditions are objectives that need to be achieved prior to the closing of the transaction. There are certain requirements that the buyer and/or the seller may have that have to be satisfied as a condition to closing the transaction. Some of the key closing conditions that you want to consider are board approval for the parties, shareholder approval of the seller, governmental consents. The government may require that certain consents be satisfied before the transaction closes, that employees accept employment with the purchaser in the transaction prior to closing. In addition, a seller may insist, if the buyer has a financing contingency, that financing be approved prior to closing the transaction. Closing conditions need to be satisfied prior to the closing of the transaction. So oftentimes, counsel will be helpful in negotiating those closing conditions and making sure that those closing conditions have been achieved. Oftentimes, if a closing condition hasn't been satisfied and it's not material to the transaction, the buyer may decide to waive that closing condition and close anyway, even though that condition hasn't been satisfied. One of the key closing conditions is shareholder approval. Shareholder approval basically is a negotiation between the buyer and the seller as to how much or what percentage of the shareholder base needs to approve a particular transaction before it can move forward. The buyer is going to insist on a very high threshold or percentage of the shareholders to approve a particular transaction. The seller will want a smaller threshold to close the transaction. So there's a dynamic at work, and counsel can be very helpful in trying to negotiate that percentage to make sure it's appropriate for a particular transaction.